thought with the Supreme Court taking on the case against affirmative action, I would take a moment to briefly discuss what affirmative action is and how it came to be, its history, and so on, as well as some of the effects of the policy and the effects of the steady repealing of the policy. There's a prevailing myth in modern discourse that affirmative action is a get into college free card for non-white people. And this is simply not the case. It is a rhetorical device that's been in conservative circles for decades now. But it also is very dangerous to go down that road because affirmative action is linked to one of the most important rights that everyone has. And that is the right to unionize. So, what do I mean by that? Affirmative action as a concept was first entered into political discussion actually around the 1930s, in leading up to and involving the establishment of the 1935 Wagner Act, which gave the federal government the ability to regulate employer-employee relationships, which changed the dynamic away from the prevailing policy of freedom of contract, which is essentially what we now call like right to work. It's basically a employer negotiates whatever they want with an employee, and there's no oversight to that. They can exploit that employee as much as they want, and as long as the employee is doing the labor, they're considered consenting to the terms. Now, this policy, in effect, created the ability for the government to back up collective bargaining, because without this policy, it would be possible for the employer to punish employees for trying to organize. They could fire them or cut their pay or whatever else sort of coercive measures they wished to. The Wagner Act protected the right to unionize and to collectively bargain, and it said that the government will actually step in to intercede if a company was not taking affirmative action to allow their employees to do so. So, that led to workers being able to negotiate things like hiring and firing practices, negotiate for higher wages, negotiate for promotion paths that were being given just through nepotism to the employers, friends and family and whatnot, etc. And it allowed them to do this through like a democratic process. Unions were redefined as a public good that the government would step in to back up. Now, this establishment did have some rough patches initially. This was the 1930s, so equality was not a thing, even remotely. And this meant that initially several unions formed through the labor movement that were explicitly white. Now, through the 1940s, the Supreme Court did take on several cases which established that unions could not discriminate. So it cracked down on things like the Jim Crow unionization down here in the South. It I don't have the case names in front of me, but there were two notable cases in 1944, especially, that the court weighed in on with this new regulatory power established by the Wagner Act, to assert that affirmative action must also extend to all people. That's quite notable for something from the 1940s. That's before the civil rights movement, before they even had a right to vote. They were able to join unions. So that's a little bit of its earliest history. Now, in 1961, Kennedy really thrust the term affirmative action out into the public consciousness, largely by being very, very charismatic in television and radio and all of these things. The term had been around, but JFK really made it resonate with people. And when he signed the Executive Order 10925, which authorized the government to cancel contracts with vendors failing to take affirmative action to redress employment disparities, he was quoted saying that they would have to take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and employees are treated fairly during employment without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. So this is a broad spectrum of anti-discrimination law. And it's this is kind of a little bit of a difficult area to implement, and this is something that this sort of law has always struggled with, which is proving discrimination, right? Now, this made it so that they could not have explicit policy or explicit decision-making along these lines. But it also was an appeal to colorblindness, right? Now, colorblind policy typically means you have a white employer working for a white board of directors or investors who has implicit biases where they will still favor an unqualified white applicant over a qualified black applicant. These biases do exist. They persist very broadly, even when people are not aware of them. So it is difficult to implement, but it was also a very important policy to put into place. Now, all of this so far has had to do with the workplace. So why, how did it get into education? We'll get there, but so the labor movement was through the 1960s. They actually got even closer with the civil rights movement and started to see not all unions, mind you, but a great number of unions saw their struggle for workers' rights as in partnership with Black struggle to gain equal rights in general. So there was a lot of partnerships that took place there. Martin Luther King famously was very, very close to and influential within the labor movement. And labor unions broadly supported, both financially and with manpower, the 1963 March on Washington. So, affirmative action in the workplace, it's rooted in the Wagner Act, and it protects not only the right for workers to unionize and for the government to back up those unions as they get established, but it also developed to expand to anti-discrimination within those structures. It's a policy that doesn't delineate explicit things that must be done, but is more of a coda of this should be your operating goal that you work towards. And if you are seen as not working towards it, the government can intercede, can cancel contracts with you, and can back up and empower unions. Now, this understanding, this new lens of affirmative action as it became really part of the public consciousness, as it saturated more of the union movement, there was also this other question that was going on. And we've talked about this before on this channel, about desegregating schools. Through the 60s, this was an ongoing battle where schools were explicitly segregated. And even once a ruling came down that schools must desegregate, there were still all kinds of efforts to ignore that ruling, that decision, leading all the way to Brown v. Board, and frankly leading through today to the religious right basically coalescing around outrage about desegregating schools. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Through the 1960s, these policies of affirmative action were handed down to educational institutions as well. They were saying, look, you have to admit students regardless of any of these things, their national origin, their color, their creed, their race, etc. And this took on several different forms. There wasn't a explicit policy that had to be implemented, so different colleges took it in different directions. Some of them implemented quotas, 13% of the population here is black, therefore we should admit 13 black students for every 100. Some put in point systems where a minority student would get a couple of extra points in the decision making of their application process, etc. I'm not going to get into which policies were the best, which weren't. I don't know all of the implementations. What we do know is that this is when the myth was formed about this affirmative action being a get into college free card for non-white students. Harvard's dean especially, David Evans at the time, raised the flag of reverse racism, insisting that, in his words, semi-literate blacks are being accepted at the expense of white geniuses. This was not the case. You still had to pass a very rigorous enrollment process to get into Harvard. No semi-literate blacks were being enrolled into Harvard. David Evans was just lying because his school was no longer explicitly and thoroughly saturated with white people. and he was mad about it. Now, this is a line that has unfortunately persisted, and it has persisted in no small part due to several white graduates of these very prolific schools like Harvard and such, carrying that resentment with them and themselves moving into influential spaces where they have a microphone and continue to perpetuate those ideas. In the 1970s, the Supreme Court did shut down one of these forms of policy, the quota system. They said the quota system isn't working. They ruled it unconstitutional by 1978. Race could still be considered as a factor during the enrollment process, but racial quotas themselves gone. It's important to note that the Supreme Court, as it's hearing these cases, overwhelmingly, pretty much explicitly white, through the 70s. The people bringing the cases to them, the lawyers, also white. There is going to be implicit bias in these sorts of cases, for sure. Sometimes explicit bias. But it's important to keep that in mind, because over the decades since, the Supreme Court has continued to peel back affirmative action in various forms, typically in response to accusations and legal arguments around reverse racism. Now, these arguments are being made despite the fact that white people still overwhelmingly dominate educational spaces, college spaces, workplace positions of management, etc. That white people continue to have higher wages. All of these things, if reverse racism were actually a thing that had power, we would see effects of that in the data, but we don't. What we continue to see is that white people continue to enjoy a system that is run by white people that still errs on the side of white people. Some states, such as Texas and Florida, have already banned affirmative action in education in its entirety, and in large part, de facto, in employment. Again, that's your right to work laws and stuff, where they've basically gone all the way full circle and gone back to freedom of contract, where you are working, as long as you're working, you accept the terms that your employer has laid before you, and the government washes its hands of it. They do not have your back. They do not care about your right to unionize. As a result, we have also seen schools shifting back into segregated spaces, I believe, where you have like schools that are considered black schools, schools that are considered normal schools, which are where all the white people are, because there exist economic barriers delineating the population along racial lines. We also see in college enrollments this erosion of affirmative action having a very real impact. A 2013 study found that students of color getting into the top public colleges dropped by about 23% following the ban of affirmative action in those enrollment cases. Now, make no mistake about it, attacks on affirmative action in educational spaces is just a stepping stone on the desire by capitalists and conservatives to repeal the right to unionize whatsoever, to carve back the 1935 Wagner Act and return everything back to what they think they want, which is employers being lords over their workers, being able to be as explicitly discriminatory as they wish, and being able to be as exploitative as they wish with workers, regardless of their race, having no ability to get redress of their grievances. That is the future that is being pursued by those who oppose affirmative action broadly. There is a case to be made that we should not need affirmative action, but until we achieve a society wherein there actually is equality, wherein there is not systems of bias excluding large swaths of the population, we need something to put some lever of power in our pocket. Because otherwise, it's every man for themselves against the extremely powerful who can squash each individual like a bug. Anyway, hope that something in that discussion was useful or informative. As usual, thank you to my Patreon supporters for supporting the channel. If you're interested in supporting the channel, links below. I'm also going to include a couple of the resources I use to kind of research some of this history down below if you want to read more. Yeah, that's all. See you in the next video.